In this lecture, we will be looking at Chapter 8, Separate but Unequal, Women's Sphere and the New Art. And we're going to begin with a discussion of the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition of 1876. And this represented a milestone in women's struggles to achieve visibility in American cultural life. A tenth of the works of art at the U.S. section were by women, which is a rise in numbers, but again, it's only a tenth of the art. The exhibition also boasted a woman's pavilion with over 40,000 square feet of exhibition space devoted to the work of almost 1,500 women from at least 13 countries. And you can see the image here is of the women's pavilion. However, the building's existence as a segregated display area had been contested from the beginning. The presence of a separate space for women signaled an institutionalizing of women's productions in isolation from those of men. Sensitive to the implications of exhibiting women's art only in relation to other areas of feminine creativity actually angered activists because no attention was given to women's wages and working conditions, and many feminists refused to participate. Ironically, the building became both the most powerful and conspicuous symbol of the women's movement for equal rights and the most visible indication of women's separate stature. The pavilion's eclectic and controversial exhibits included furniture, weaving, laundry, appliances, embroideries, education and scientific exhibitions, and sculpture, painting, and photography, as well as engraving. The lumping together of the fine arts, industrial arts, and handicrafts and the work of professional and amateur artists implicitly equated the work of all women on the basis of gender alone. Critics were quick to challenge the displays for their lack of quality, and women once again found themselves confronting universalizing definitions of women's production in a gender-segregated world. And that's going to bring us to the first artist that we're going to focus on in this lecture, and that's Marie Cassatt. Her date's 1844 to 1926. Now, she was the daughter of a wealthy Pennsylvanian businessman, and she became a student at the Pennsylvania Academy in 1861. By 1866, she was settled in Paris, where she was soon joined by the rest of her family. Her teas were a mecca for younger women, and she was generous with introductions and advice, and her professional commitment was an inspiration to the young students. May Alcott's comments reveal the conflict still facing the woman artist caught within an ideology of sexual difference which gave the privilege to male expression and often forced women to choose between marriage and a career. During the years when Cassatt, May Alcott, and other young women flocked to Paris for study, the city itself was actually undergoing dramatic changes. The rebuilding of Paris by Baron Haussmann and Napoleon III in the 1850s and 1860s physically transformed the cities. The collapse of the Second Empire in 1870 and the establishment of the Third Republic in 1875 produced an increasingly democratized middle-class culture. By the 1870s, an active consuming public flowed through the boulevards, department stores, and international expositions. The Impressionists produced their own version of modernity, but their stylistic innovations and their new subject matter was the sign of a larger context of restructuring of public and private spheres. In Modernity and Spaces of Femininity, Griselda Pollock maps the new spaces of masculinity and femininity and articulates the differences socially, economic, and subjectively between being a woman and being a man in Paris at the end of the century. Some women were drawn to Impressionism precisely because the new painting legitimized the subject matter of domestic social life, of which women had intimate knowledge, even as they were excluded from imagery of the bourgeoisie social sphere of the boulevard, cafe, and dance hall. As upper-class women, both Berthe Morisot and Cassatt did not have access to the easy exchange of ideas about painting which took place among male artists in the studio and cafe, meaning as upper-class women, they weren't allowed to be in these places. While many of the people in Paris were going to cafes, out in the streets, the dance halls, the upper-class women were still excluded from them. However, though, the Morisots were regulars at Manet's Thursday evening soirées, and Cassatt and Degas regularly exchanged ideas about painting. Critics of the time appear to not have ranked the subject matter of Morisot's work in any way different from that of her male colleagues, though most of them agreed that her presentation of it was more agreeable. Work now being done on the social meanings produced by Impressionist paintings suggests a complex relationship between the new painting and the new middle-class family. The decision to work on plein air, meaning out in the open air, they literally would take their canvases and the paints out and paint in the world. This decision to do that and to forego the historical subjects with the complex studio setups and multiple models they required transformed the relationship between the painter's daily life and his or her studio life. But it was the decision to paint scenes of everyday life that moved the easel into the drawing room. Working-class women were admired for entertaining men. However, at the same time, professional women with public roles are seen as usurpers of male authority or destroyers of domestic harmony as they were earlier. The modern feminist movement in France, which was launched in 1866, organized the first International Congress of Women's Rights in 1878. And this was at the very height of Impressionism, but Impressionist paintings record no traces of this aspect of contemporary life. Nor does it acknowledge the increasing numbers of middle-class women who are seeking training and employment outside the home. Morisot and Cassat's ability to sustain professional lives and negotiate relationships of some parity with their male colleagues was a class-specific issue. Morisot was married to Manet's brother Eugene, and she came from a wealthy family who supported her work. Cassat was an unmarried daughter and this provided the secure network of relationships from which she drew her art. And now to discuss Berthe Morisot a little bit in detail. Her date's 1841 to 1895, and she was the youngest of 3 daughters of a wealthy French civil servant. She displayed an early talent for drawing, and what's interesting is her mother was trying to get her and her sister's training, and she was warned that getting someone of her class professional training would turn her into a painter, which would be revolutionary, might I say, catastrophic, meaning it was something that shouldn't have been done for an upper-class woman. However, Morisot numbered Manet, Renoir, Degas, Picasso, and Monet among her friends. She was married to Manet's brother Eugene in 1874, and she was described in 1877 by a critic for Le Temps as the, quote, one real impressionist in this group, unquote. Yet, art historians almost exclusively frame her work within the structures of her associations with male painters. Her own letters to her sister often expressed her own hesitations and doubts about her works. Her subjects, again, were drawn from everyday life, like most Impressionists. The casual immediacy, straightforward approach to subject matter, and feathery brushstrokes of her paintings meld contemporary subjects with the Impressionist desire to capture the transitory effects of life. Now, Morisot and Cassat met around 1878, probably through Degas, who encouraged Cassat to exhibit with the Impressionists after a painting she had submitted to the Salon was rejected. Cassat at that time had been exhibiting for more than 10 years when she joined the Impressionist group. Her subjects evolved within the boundaries of her sex and class. They were prevented from asking men other than family members to pose and limited in their access to the public life of the cafe and the boulevard. They concentrated, though, on the aspects of modern domestic life. Cassat brought an incisive eye to bear on the rituals and gestures through which femininity is constructed and signified: crocheting, embroidering, knitting, attending children, visiting, and taking tea. Her works, though, are less universalized depictions of maternity rather than responses to the specific ways that social class is reproduced through the family. Both also show return to the conventional association with women in mirrors. You can see that with the image on the right, that's Morisot's Psyche from 1876, and the image on the left, which is Cassat's Mother and Child, circa 1905. These paintings also perpetuate the notion of vanity as natural to women, but when we look closer, that's really not what they are doing. Morisot's painting is a deeply sympathetic representation of self-awareness and awakening sexuality, while Cassatt's painting emphasizes the role of the mirror in instilling an idea of femininity, something that is mediated through observation. Also, looking at Cassatt's Woman in Black at the Opera from 1880. Here we have the subject of the ball, dancer, or opera was a popular one among Impressionists, and one in which the event and the audience could be collapsed into the same spectacle. Here, our main person, the woman in black, is watching the performance, but she herself has also become part of the spectacle. We can see that with the man in the upper balcony, leering, looking at her through the glasses. With works such as this, art historians have begun to explore the ways that modern women mobilized a new range of female gazes within a developing consumer society. Women's growing participation in the consumer culture that increasingly defines modernity during the second half of the 19th century challenges earlier notions of the social relegation of women to completely separate, usually domestic spheres. Although women's role as spectacle continues to dominate much of the period's visual culture, female spectatorship begins to emerge as a social reality within spaces like those of crowds, department stores, and mass marketing and advertising. And then that's going to bring us to the decorative arts. Again, the new focus on the middle-class home and the self-sufficient world which it signified is central to the reform of the decorative arts in England and America. There were markedly more women in the design fields by the 1860s as a result of institutionalized art education for women. The surge of interest in art pottery was sparked by the efforts of the two of the most famous ceramic firms in Britain. This was Milton and Dalton, and their desire to produce handcrafted wares on a large commercial scale for middle-class homes. Commercial production, however, was organized around traditional divisions of labor. While male designers received credit for their designs of china surfaces, the painters, who were usually female and often working in artisan class, remained anonymous. At the heart of the arts and craft movement was a pre-industrial medieval ideal of a fusion of the design and the maker. Revolting against the anonymous authorship and shoddy craftsmanship of industrially produced goods, William Morris, the main driving force of the arts and craft movement, dreamed of a socialist utopia in which individuals were not alienated for their labor. Wishing to make art available to everyone and to unite artists, designers, and craft workers around the ideals of craftsmanship, good design, and the renewed dignity of labor, Morris dreamed of setting up small workshops and countrywide organizations which could revive dying traditions like lace making and crewel embroidery. Morris anticipated a day when the sexual division of labor within the arts would vanish and domestic life would be equally shared by the sexes. However, the reality of the movement was the gradual evolution of an entirely traditional sexual division of labor within the movement itself, with women staffing the embroidery workshops and men conducting the business and serving as named designers. Apart from the embroidery section, the Morris firm employed few women in its workshops, and the general involvement of women was heavily weighted in the direction of traditionally feminine undertakings like lace and needleworks. So although Morris had these grand ideas, that's not actually what happened within the arts and craft movement. Therefore, the American arts and craft movement was more stylistic than ideological. Yet, it provided many middle-class women with a socially respectable and humanitarian outlet for their artistic production. A surprising number of American women went on to professional careers in the field of art pottery, despite the fact that women's involvement in the arts and craft movement began with socially prominent women wishing to refine their skills as an accomplishment. For example, we see this in Maria Lingsworth Nicholas' later store, her dates 1849 to 1932. And she began experimenting with underglaze techniques at Dallas Pottery in Cincinnati. In 1879, her father offered her a premises of her own, and Rookwood Pottery, shown here on the right, was founded in spring of 1880. Her family's wealth, her father's long history of artistic patronage, and her own social standing in Cincinnati made possible her increasing professionalism. Her work was viewed as both morally and artistically charitable, for she, quote, follows the traditions of her family in devotion to the well-being and advancement of her native place, unquote. Despite its labor practices, which included a division between designer and decorator that became the model for most art potteries, the Rookwood pottery played a formative role in the development of art pottery in America. Now, the full history of the women's involvement in the art pottery movement, including the Cincinnati Women's Traditional Training Centers and art clubs, does still remain to be written. Intimately connected with women's roles as domestic and social reformers, the art pottery movement also represents a move by American middle-class women to professionalize the decorative arts. And that's going to bring us to the World's Fair, which opened in Chicago in 1893. And by that time, American women had evolved a new sense of identity and purpose. Groups came together to organize a woman's building, shown here, and intended to prove that women's achievements were equal to those of men's. The fair afforded women an unprecedented opportunity to present to the world a justification of her claim to be placed on complete equality with man. The director of the women's building was in the hands of Mrs. Potter Palmer, who was a wealthy Chicago art collector, and her 117-member board of lady managers. Although women had made great strides in education, art training, and social organizing, they still lacked the right to vote. And they remained caught between the demands of careers and motherhood, struggling continually against the limitations placed on them by the social category of femininity, against the trivialization of their work in relation to that of men, and against the mythologizing of its otherness. The building itself was designed by Sophia G. Hayden, who was a young graduate of MIT's Architecture and Design program. However, critics, in praising her work, noted, if sweetness and light were ever expressed in architecture, we find them in Miss Hayden's building. Hayden's building, in fact, was admirably suited to the neoclassical Beaux Arts style, which dominated the fair's building, and the idea of sweetness and light was associated directly with her being a woman. The divisions between the various factions involved in the women's building make a very complex chapter in the history of the late 19th century American feminism. Nevertheless, women's creative presence was more powerfully felt in Chicago in 1893 than at any other time in the country's history. Some professional women continued to resist exhibiting alongside amateurs in a building that included everything from household goods to embroidery. Others wished to exhibit with men in the fine arts building. The result of the segregation and wide range of amateur and professional production, wrote one critic, was, quote, a gorgeous wealth of mediocrity, unquote. In the end, despite the diverseness of its display and the critics' argument that mediocrity was the only possible result when, quote, femininity was the first requisite and merit a second consideration, unquote, the women's building overwhelmed visitors by the sheer magnitude and ambition of its displays. The building summed up women's past achievement and made visible the multiple ways they had renegotiated the ideology of separate spheres, but the future belonged to a new generation and a new century. And we see this in the idea of the new woman. In the same decade that welcomed the woman's building as a visible sign of women's advancements in education and professional life, also witnessed an escalation of rhetoric drawing on discourses of science to legitimize women's natural inferiority and difference from men in fields from art to medicine. By 1893, a new female heroine had emerged in the popular literary imagination. These were female heroes who were in direct conflict with traditional values of conservative society. Flaunting convention, the new woman drinks, she smokes, she reads books, and she leads a healthy, athletic life. By 1900, feminists were demanding not just voting rights for women, but that their right to higher education and the right to earn an income, and here we see the modern woman had appeared.